I remember the exact time because I had been staring at the digital clock on the bedside monitor for what felt like hours. 3:17 in the morning. The red numbers burned into my vision like a brand, mocking me with their steady progression through another sleepless night. The Vermont Sleep Research Center was supposed to be my salvation. That's what Elise had said when she handed me the pamphlet with its cheerful stock photos of people sleeping peacefully under pristine white sheets. "Fix this, Julian," she had said without saying it. "Fix whatever is keeping you from me, from us, from the life we built together." But lying there in that sterile room, tangled in a web of sensors and wires that monitored every breath I didn't take, every dream I didn't have, I knew this wasn't about medicine. The electrodes taped to my scalp felt like accusations. The pulse oximeter on my finger was a tiny shackle. Everything about this place was designed to quantify sleep, to reduce the mystery of rest to data points and brain waves. They could measure my REM cycles, but they couldn't measure the weight that sat on my chest every night, the unnamed thing that made my own bed feel like a foreign country. The room was divided by a thin curtain, the kind you see in hospital emergency rooms. Privacy that wasn't really privacy. I could hear everything from the other side. The rustle of sheets, the soft beep of monitors, the measured breathing of another man who couldn't sleep. His name was Emery Callahan. I had learned this during the intake process, when we sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs filling out forms about our sleep histories. He was younger than me, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of easy smile that suggested he found the world more interesting than disappointing. While I hunched over my clipboard, checking boxes for anxiety and restlessness, he hummed quietly to himself, a tune I didn't recognize but somehow found comforting. The technicians had explained the process with clinical detachment. We would be monitored for 5 consecutive nights. They would track our sleep patterns, our movements, our breathing. They would wake us at predetermined intervals to ask about our dreams. The whole thing felt like an elaborate performance where I was both the actor and the audience, desperately trying to sleep while knowing that every twitch was being recorded. But now, in the deep quiet of the third night, with the overhead fluorescence dimmed to a soft red glow that made everything look like we were developing photographs in a darkroom, I found myself listening to Emery's breathing more than the machines. His rhythm was different from mine, slower, more deliberate, like he was trying to breathe himself into a place I couldn't reach. I turned onto my side, the wires shifting with me like seaweed in a current. The movement felt loud in the silence. Too loud. I held my breath, waiting for the technicians to come check on me, to ask if I was experiencing discomfort, to mark another note in my file about restlessness and sleep disturbance. Instead, I heard Emery's voice, soft and unguarded in the darkness. "You still awake?" The question hung in the air between us, separated by that thin curtain, but somehow intimate. I should have pretended to be asleep. That would have been the normal thing to do, the polite thing. But something in his voice, a loneliness that matched my own, made me answer without thinking. "Yeah," I said. "Can't seem to turn my brain off." There was a pause. I could hear him shifting in his bed, the plastic mattress cover crinkling like cellophane. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. "Would it be weird if I asked you to switch beds? Just for one night?" The question was so unexpected that I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. We were adults in a medical facility, wired up like astronauts, being monitored by technicians who would review every second of our sleep data. The idea of switching beds was not just weird, it was impossible. But I didn't laugh, and I didn't say no immediately. Instead, I lay there in the red-tinted darkness, feeling something shift inside me. Something that had been locked away for so long I had forgotten it existed. The silence stretched between us. I could hear the distant hum of the air conditioning system, the soft electronic beeping of our monitors, the whisper of my own pulse in my ears. Outside, Vermont was sleeping. Inside, 2 men lay awake, separated by fabric and propriety and the weight of lives that had brought them to this strange place. I don't know why I didn't dismiss his request outright. Maybe it was the way he had asked it, without expectation or demand. Maybe it was the simple honesty of admitting he was struggling too. Or maybe it was because, in that moment, I realized I was tired of being alone with my insomnia, tired of wrestling with sleeplessness like it was a private shame. The curtain between us wasn't just a medical privacy screen. It was a boundary I had built around myself years ago, a barrier that kept me separate from the possibility of connection, of being seen, of being known. And now this stranger was asking me to cross it. I reached out in the darkness, my fingers finding the edge of the curtain. The fabric was rougher than I expected, institutional and impersonal. But as I held it in my hand, feeling its weight, I felt something else. A possibility. A door opening onto something I didn't have words for yet. Without fully understanding why, without analyzing the risks or the implications, or what it might mean for my marriage or my carefully constructed life, I pulled back the curtain. The space between our beds was barely 3 feet, but it felt like crossing a continent. Emery looked at me in the dim red light, his expression unreadable. There was something vulnerable in his face, something that made my chest tighten with recognition. Neither of us said anything. We just looked at each other across that small distance, two men who had come to this place seeking sleep and found something else entirely. Something that would change everything, though I didn't know it yet. The monitors continued their electronic symphony. The air conditioning hummed its mechanical lullaby. And somewhere in the darkness of a sleep clinic in Vermont, with wires trailing behind me like the traces of a life I was slowly leaving behind, I took the first step toward a truth I wasn't ready to name. I should tell you about the life I was living before that curtain came down. Before Emery Callahan became the name I whispered to myself in the shower. Before everything I thought I knew about myself unraveled like a sweater with one loose thread. I was 41 years old, though I felt decades older on most mornings. A physics professor at Trinity College, tenured and respected, with a corner office that overlooked the quad where students moved like particles in Brownian motion between classes. I taught quantum mechanics to undergraduates who couldn't fathom how two particles could be entangled across vast distances, how measuring one could instantaneously affect the other. The irony wasn't lost on me, even then. My marriage to Elise had lasted 18 years, which felt like both a lifetime and no time at all. We had built something solid and respectable, a colonial house in West Hartford with good bones and a mortgage that would be paid off in 12 more years. The kind of house where you could imagine growing old gracefully, where the hardwood floors creaked in familiar places and the kitchen windows caught the morning light just so. Elise was a librarian at the Hartford Public Library, a woman who understood the value of quiet spaces and careful organization. She had auburn hair that she kept in a neat bob, reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck, and the kind of gentle competence that made people trust her immediately. Patrons would seek her out specifically when they needed help finding something, as if she were a human card catalog who could locate any piece of information with patience and precision. We had been good together, once. Good in the way that complementary colors are good, different enough to be interesting, but harmonious enough to work. She was earth tones, and I was cool blues. She was Sunday morning crosswords, and I was late-night documentaries. She was the one who remembered to water the plants, and I was the one who fixed things when they broke. Our daughter Naomi had been the bridge between us for 17 years, the shared project that gave our partnership purpose and direction. She was brilliant like her mother, curious like me, and possessed of an independence that both thrilled and terrified us. 3 months ago, she had left for her freshman year at Oberlin, and the house had contracted around her absence like a lung exhaling. The silence was what got to me first. Not the obvious silences, like the lack of her violin practice or the absence of her friends thundering up and down the stairs. It was the subtler quiet that settled over our dinner table, the way Elise and I would sit across from each other with nothing urgent to discuss. We had become skilled at the gentle maintenance of daily life, passing each other salt and small talk in equal measure, but somewhere along the way we had stopped seeing each other with fresh eyes. I would wake at 5:30 every morning, not because I had to, but because my body had trained itself to expect consciousness at that hour. The alarm clock was unnecessary. My internal chronometer was more reliable than any mechanical device. I would lie in bed for exactly 7 minutes, listening to Elise's breathing beside me, then slip out carefully to avoid waking her. The morning routine was sacred in its predictability. Black coffee in the ceramic mug Naomi had made in middle school pottery class, the one with the slightly lopsided handle that fit my fingers perfectly. The Hartford Courant spread across the kitchen table, though I rarely read beyond the headlines. A piece of toast with marmalade, the same British brand Elise had discovered years ago and now ordered online because the local stores didn't carry it. I would kiss her goodbye at exactly 6:42, a brief press of lips against her forehead while she stood at the kitchen sink in her bathrobe, coffee mug in hand. She would murmur something about her day, about the new exhibition the library was planning or the book club she was moderating, and I would make appropriate responses while my mind was already racing ahead to my first lecture. The drive to campus took exactly 17 minutes if I hit the lights right. I knew every pothole, every yield sign, every house where the elderly man walked his ancient golden retriever at precisely 7:15 each morning. My life had become a series of measurements, of known quantities and predictable outcomes. Even my insomnia had patterns. I would fall asleep easily enough, but wake at 2:30 or 3, my mind suddenly electric with equations and anxieties that had no clear source. Those were the hours when I would walk through our house like a ghost, checking locks that I knew were secure, adjusting thermostats that were already set correctly, standing in Naomi's empty room, and trying to remember what it felt like to be needed. The grandfather clock in the hallway would mark each quarter hour with its soft chime, and I would count them like a prisoner marking days on a cell wall. Elise noticed, of course. She was too observant not to see the dark circles under my eyes, the way I would startle when she spoke to me, the increasing frequency of my nighttime wanderings. She began leaving articles about sleep hygiene on my desk, bookmarks from medical websites about insomnia treatment, gentle suggestions wrapped in the language of concern. The sleep study was her idea, presented to me on a Tuesday evening over dinner with the same calm efficiency she used to help library patrons find rare books. She had already researched the Vermont Sleep Research Center, had spoken to our family doctor about referrals, had even checked our insurance coverage. All I had to do was say yes. I should have recognized it as a kind of intervention, a loving attempt to solve a problem that was eating away at both of us. But I was too tired to see clearly, too caught up in the mechanics of my own exhaustion to understand that what I was experiencing wasn't just medical. It was existential. Looking back now, I can see how carefully I had constructed my life to avoid any kind of uncertainty. My career was built on immutable laws, on equations that always balanced, on principles that held true regardless of human desire or emotion. At home, I had created routines that functioned like mathematical proofs, each step following logically from the previous one. But somewhere in the space between my public competence and my private restlessness, something had gotten lost. Some essential part of myself had been filed away in the name of responsibility and respectability, stored in a place so remote I had forgotten it existed. The night before I left for Vermont, Elise and I made love for the first time in months. It was gentle and familiar, a choreography we had perfected over years of practice. She moved beneath me with the same quiet grace she brought to everything else, and I moved above her with the same careful attention to her needs that had always defined our intimacy. Afterward, as we lay in our respective territories of the king-sized bed, she traced lazy circles on my chest with her fingertip and said she hoped the study would help me sleep better. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what better would look like anymore. I had no way of knowing that in 3 days, I would be lying in a different bed, listening to a stranger's breathing, feeling more awake than I had in years. That the careful architecture of my tired life was about to be demolished by a simple question asked in darkness, by a man who would see me in ways I had forgotten were possible. The morning I drove to Vermont, I kissed Elise goodbye at the usual time, in the usual way. She wished me luck and told me she loved me, and I said the same words back to her, because that was what we did. But as I pulled out of our driveway, watching our house recede in the rearview mirror, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt like I was finally going somewhere. The first 2 nights at the sleep clinic passed in a blur of failed attempts at rest and awkward morning debriefings with the technicians. They would wake us at 6:30 with the artificial cheerfulness of people who had been awake all night watching us not sleep, asking questions about our dreams as if we were elementary school children reporting on summer vacation. I had no dreams to report, only the strange liminal space between consciousness and something that wasn't quite sleep, punctuated by the soft sounds of Emery moving in the bed beside mine. We had barely spoken after that first night when I pulled back the curtain. The next morning, when the technicians came to disconnect our monitoring equipment, we had exchanged polite nods and retreated into our separate routines as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. I could feel it in the way the air seemed charged between us, in the careful way we avoided looking directly at each other during the day. The clinic had a small common area where patients could spend time between sleep sessions, furnished with the kind of aggressively neutral furniture you find in medical waiting rooms. Emery would sit in the corner chair, reading paperback novels with cracked spines, while I pretended to grade papers at the small table by the window. I found myself studying him when I thought he wasn't looking. He moved through the world with an ease that I envied, as if he had never learned to doubt his right to take up space. When he read, he would sometimes smile at something on the page, a private amusement that made me wonder what kind of stories captured his attention. When he ate the institutional meals they served us, he would close his eyes on the first bite, as if he were tasting something much more complex than hospital food. He was a carpenter. I learned from overhearing his conversations with the staff. He worked with his hands, building things that would outlast him, shaping wood into forms that served a purpose. There was something about this that struck me as fundamentally different from my own work, where I dealt in abstractions and theories, where the most concrete thing I produced was a grade on a student's paper. On the third night, the technicians made a change to the protocol. Instead of keeping the overhead lights on until 10, they switched them off early, leaving us in that red-tinted darkness that made everything feel like we were underwater. The change was subtle, but it shifted the atmosphere of the room, made it feel more intimate, more like a place where secrets might be shared. I lay in my bed, listening to the familiar symphony of electronic monitoring, when Emery's voice broke the silence. He didn't ask if I was awake this time. He simply began talking, his words floating across the narrow space between us like smoke. He told me about his work, about the satisfaction of joining two pieces of wood with such precision that the seam became invisible. He talked about the smell of different woods, how oak was honest and pine was eager and cherry was patient. He described the way morning light moved across the workshop where he spent his days, how it changed the color of the sawdust that hung in the air like golden snow. I found myself talking back, though I couldn't remember making the decision to speak. I told him about quantum entanglement, about how Einstein had called it spooky action at a distance because he couldn't accept that two particles could affect each other instantaneously across the vastness of space. I explained how observation changed everything, how the act of measuring something altered its fundamental nature. He listened without interrupting, and I could hear him breathing in the darkness, could sense him following the thread of my thoughts even when I wasn't sure I understood them myself. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that stopped my heart. "That sounds lonely," he said, "being connected to something but never being able to touch it." I had never thought of quantum mechanics in emotional terms, but his words revealed something I had been carrying without knowing it. The loneliness of observation without connection, of understanding without intimacy. I felt suddenly exposed, as if he had seen something in me that I had kept hidden even from myself. We talked until nearly dawn that night, about everything and nothing. He told me about growing up in a small town in Maine where everyone knew everyone else's business, where being different was something you learned to hide or leave behind. He talked about his father, who had been a fisherman until the industry collapsed, who had spent his final years building boats that would never see water, as if he could resurrect something that was already dead. I told him about Naomi, about the way she had looked at me when I explained why I wouldn't be home for a week, the mixture of concern and resignation in her eyes. I talked about Elise, about how we had become like two ships passing in the night, maintaining safe distances to avoid collision. There was something about the darkness that made confession easier, as if the absence of light somehow absolved us of the need to guard our words. We spoke in whispers, not because we were afraid of being heard by the technicians, but because what we were sharing felt too fragile for normal volume. The next morning, we pretended it hadn't happened. We nodded politely when the technicians asked how we had slept, gave non-committal answers about our dreams, ate our institutional breakfast in companionable silence. But the pretense felt thin, like ice forming over moving water. That day, I found myself watching Emery differently. I noticed the way he held his coffee cup, wrapping both hands around it, as if he were trying to absorb its warmth. I saw how he would pause sometimes while reading, staring out the window at the Vermont landscape with an expression I couldn't quite read. When he smiled at something in his book, I felt a strange pride, as if I had been somehow responsible for his amusement. The fourth night brought snow, the first real storm of the season. I could hear it against the windows, a soft percussion that made the clinic feel even more isolated from the world outside. The technicians commented on it during their evening rounds, joking about how the weather would make their commute home more interesting. But I was grateful for the snow. It felt like a cocoon wrapping around us, sealing us away from everything that waited beyond these walls. In the red-tinted darkness, with the sound of wind and snow creating a white noise that muffled even the electronic beeping of our monitors, the world contracted to just this room, these two beds, the space between us that felt simultaneously vast and intimate. That night, Emery didn't wait for me to speak first. As soon as the technicians finished their final check and left us alone, he turned toward me in the darkness and said my name. Just that, Julian. But he said it like he was testing the weight of it, like he was trying to understand how it felt in his mouth. He told me about the panic attacks that had brought him to the clinic, how he would wake in the middle of the night feeling like he was drowning in his own bed. He described the sensation of being trapped in his own body, of wanting to run but having nowhere to go. He had never told anyone about them, not even his doctor, until the night he had called the clinic's intake number at 3 in the morning, desperate for any kind of help. I listened to him with my whole body, the way I had learned to listen to the subtleties of student presentations. But this was different. This was listening as an act of witness, of holding space for someone else's pain. When he finished, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything we weren't saying, everything we were slowly learning to feel. I told him about my own sleeplessness, about the way I would walk through my house in the middle of the night like a ghost haunting his own life. I described the feeling of being disconnected from my own existence, of watching my days unfold as if I were observing someone else's life through a window. And then, without planning it, without considering the implications, I heard myself say something that surprised us both. I think I've been asleep for years, I said, and I'm just now starting to wake up. The words hung in the air between us, and I realized they were truer than anything I had said in a long time. Maybe truer than anything I had ever said. That night, when the deepest part of darkness settled over the clinic, when the snow continued to fall and the world outside ceased to exist, Emery asked me the question that would change everything. "Would you come here?" he said, his voice barely audible above the whisper of the heating system. "Just to see if we sleep better. I won't touch you." I should have said no. I should have explained about professional boundaries and appropriate behavior, and the fact that we were being monitored by people who would ask questions I couldn't answer. I should have reminded him that I was married, that I had a life waiting for me beyond these walls, that this was just a temporary arrangement that would end in 2 days. Instead, I said yes. I slipped out of my bed, trailing wires like a deep-sea diver, and crossed the narrow space between us. The distance was maybe 3 feet, but it felt like crossing a continent. When I reached his bed, he moved over to make room for me, and I lay down beside him, careful not to let our bodies touch. We lay there in the darkness, 2 men who barely knew each other, sharing a narrow hospital bed in a sleep clinic in Vermont, while snow fell outside and machines recorded our every breath. It should have been awkward. It should have been impossible to relax. But something remarkable happened. Our breathing began to synchronize without effort, falling into a rhythm that felt as natural as tide and moon. I could feel the warmth of his body next to mine, not touching but present, creating a field of comfort I hadn't known I was missing. For the first time in months, I felt my mind quiet. The endless loop of worry and analysis that usually kept me awake simply stopped, replaced by an awareness of this moment, this bed, this man whose presence had somehow become essential to my ability to rest. I slept. Not the shallow, fitful sleep I had grown accustomed to, but deep, restorative sleep that felt like coming home to a place I had never been. When I woke, it was to the sound of the technicians preparing for their morning rounds, and I realized that for the first time in years, I had slept through the night without waking. Emery was already awake, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. We looked at each other in the growing light, and I saw something in his eyes that reflected what I was feeling. Not desire, exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement of a connection that neither of us had been looking for, but both of us needed. The next morning, we pretended it hadn't happened. We answered the technicians' questions about our sleep quality with careful neutrality, submitted to their routine tests and measurements, ate our breakfast in silence. But the pretense felt different now, less like denial and more like protection. We were guarding something precious, something that belonged only to us. That night, neither of us asked. When the lights went out and the clinic settled into its evening quiet, I simply pulled back the curtain and slipped into his bed. He moved over to make room for me, and we lay there in the darkness, not touching but connected, our breathing finding its shared rhythm as naturally as music finding its key. I slept again, deeply, peacefully, completely. And when I woke, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. The careful architecture of my life, the structures I had built to keep myself safe and contained, had developed a crack. And through that crack, light was beginning to seep in. The days at the clinic began to blur together in a way that felt less like repetition and more like ritual. We had found our rhythm, Emery and I, in the careful choreography of shared silence and whispered confessions. During the daylight hours, we maintained our polite distance, but at night, in the red-tinted darkness that had become our sanctuary, we shed our daytime selves like clothes that no longer fit. I started to anticipate those moments when the technicians would complete their final rounds and leave us alone. The soft click of the door closing became a signal that the real day was beginning, the day that belonged only to us. I would lie in my own bed for exactly 3 minutes, listening to the settling sounds of the clinic around us, before crossing that familiar distance to join him. The narrow bed that had seemed impossibly small on that first night now felt like the only place in the world where I could truly rest. Not just sleep, though that came easier now, but rest in the deepest sense. The kind of rest that comes from being fully known, from letting down guards you didn't realize you were carrying. On the 5th night, as snow continued to fall outside and the world beyond our windows disappeared into white silence, Emery told me about his father in a way that revealed landscapes I had never imagined. He painted pictures with his words, describing a man who had spent his life reading the moods of the ocean, who could predict storms by the way seabirds moved across the sky. His father had been a lobsterman for 30 years, Emery said, until the waters got too warm and the lobsters moved north, following currents that had sustained them for generations. The man had refused to relocate, refused to admit that the ocean he knew like scripture had become a stranger. Instead, he had turned to building boats in his backyard, beautiful vessels that would never touch water because there was no longer any reason for them to exist. I watched him die a little more each day, Emery whispered into the darkness. Not from any disease, but from the simple fact that his world had ended and he didn't know how to live in the one that replaced it. There was something in the way he spoke about his father that made me understand that this was more than just a story about climate change or economic displacement. It was about the particular kind of grief that comes from watching someone you love become obsolete, from realizing that the skills and knowledge that once made them essential to the world had become as useless as a compass in a magnetic storm. He had learned carpentry from his father, he told me, in those final years when the old man needed something to do with his hands. They would work together in the garage, transforming raw wood into furniture and fixtures, creating things that would outlast them both. His father had taught him that wood had memory, that every piece carried within it the story of its growing, the seasons it had weathered, the storms it had survived. You have to listen to what the wood wants to become, his father had said. You can't force it into shapes that go against its nature. You have to work with what's already there. I found myself thinking about this as I lay beside him, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing against my shoulder. There was something about the way he talked about his craft that made me understand how different our worlds were. I worked with equations and theories, with concepts that existed only in the realm of thought. He worked with materials that had weight and texture, with things that could be touched and shaped and made beautiful. But lying there in the darkness, I began to realize that maybe those differences weren't as vast as I had imagined. Maybe we were both in the business of understanding hidden structures, of finding the patterns that gave meaning to chaos. The laws of physics and the grain of wood might be different languages, but they were both trying to describe the same fundamental truth about how things held together. That night, I told him about the friend I had almost mentioned before, the one who had made me feel something I had no name for. His name was David, and he had been my lab partner in graduate school, a brilliant physicist who saw elegance in equations that others found merely functional. We had spent countless hours together, working on experiments that required the kind of precision that only comes from absolute trust. I described the way David would bite his lower lip when he was concentrating, the way he would run his hands through his hair when he was frustrated, the way he would look at me sometimes with an expression that made my chest feel tight. I told Emery about the night we had worked until dawn on a particularly difficult calculation, how we had finally solved it just as the sun was rising, how David had looked at me in that golden light and said something that had stayed with me for 20 years. He said I was the only person he had ever met who could follow his thoughts all the way to their conclusion, who could understand not just what he was thinking, but why he was thinking it. And then he had kissed me, soft and quick, as if he were testing the weight of a possibility. I had kissed him back, I told Emery. For maybe 30 seconds, I had allowed myself to feel what I had been denying for months. But then I had pulled away, made some excuse about being tired, about needing to get home. I had spent the rest of that semester avoiding him, changing my schedule so our paths wouldn't cross, pretending that nothing had happened. David had graduated that spring and taken a position at a university in California. We had exchanged a few emails over the years, professional updates about our respective careers, but we had never spoken about that morning. I had convinced myself that it had been a moment of exhaustion, a temporary lapse in judgment brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep. But lying there beside Emery, I realized that I had been lying to myself for decades. That kiss had been the most honest moment of my entire graduate career, the only time I had allowed myself to want something without calculating the risks, without considering the implications. "Why did you pull away?" Emery asked, his voice gentle in the darkness. I told him the truth. Because I was terrified. Because I had already started building the life I thought I was supposed to want, and David represented everything that could destroy it. Because I was 25 years old and I thought I had to choose between being happy and being acceptable, and I chose acceptable. The confession hung between us like a bridge, connecting past and present in a way that felt both inevitable and impossible. I had never told anyone about David, not even Elise, who knew me better than anyone else in the world. But here, in this narrow bed in this temporary place, it felt safe to speak truths I had been carrying in silence for half my life. Emery told me about Michael, the man who had lived with him for 2 years before leaving last winter. He described him as someone who was always in motion, always planning the next adventure, the next project, the next experience that would make him feel alive. Michael had been a photographer, Emery said, someone who saw the world in terms of light and shadow, who could find beauty in the most ordinary moments. They had been happy together, in the way that people are happy when they find someone who sees the world through the same lens. Michael had photographs covering every wall of their house, Images that transformed their small space into a gallery of captured moments. Sunrise over the harbor. Children playing in puddles after rain. The way afternoon light fell across Emery's workbench, making sawdust look like gold. But Michael had been restless in ways that Emery couldn't cure. He had started talking about traveling, about seeing more of the world, about experiencing things that couldn't be found in their small coastal town. He had started staying out later, taking longer trips for work, spending more time editing photographs than taking them. One December morning, Emery had woken to find Michael packing his camera equipment into cases. He was leaving for an assignment in New Mexico, he said, but they both knew he wouldn't be coming back. He had already found someone else, a gallery owner in Santa Fe, who could offer him the kind of life that Emery couldn't provide. He left me all the photographs, Emery said, his voice barely audible. Every single one, even the ones of himself. Like he was erasing himself from his own life. I wanted to reach for him then, to offer some kind of comfort for a pain I recognized but couldn't cure. But we had established our careful boundaries, our understanding that we could share the same space without crossing lines that neither of us was ready to cross. So I lay there in the darkness, feeling the weight of his grief and my own, understanding that we were both refugees from lives that had stopped fitting us. The next morning, the technicians noticed something in our sleep data that made them ask questions. Dr. Martinez, the lead researcher, called me into her office after breakfast and showed me charts that meant nothing to me, but apparently told her everything she needed to know. Your sleep architecture has changed dramatically, she said, pointing to waves and patterns that looked like abstract art. Your REM cycles have stabilized, your sleep efficiency has improved by 40%, and your incidents of middle-of-the-night awakening have dropped to nearly zero. She paused, studying my face with the kind of clinical attention that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope. Have you made any changes to your routine? Any alterations to your sleep environment? I told her no, which was technically true. I hadn't changed anything about my sleep environment. I had simply changed where I was sleeping. But the distinction felt important, like the difference between a lie and a strategic omission. She made notes in my file, the kind of careful documentation that would follow me long after I left this place. I wondered what she was writing, what conclusions she was drawing from data that couldn't possibly capture the real story of what was happening in that room after the lights went out. That night, as I crossed the familiar distance between my bed and his, I felt something shift in the air between us. The confession had changed something, had created a new kind of intimacy that went beyond the simple comfort of shared sleep. We were no longer just two insomniacs finding solace in each other's presence. We were two men who had shown each other the places where their lives had broken, who had trusted each other with the weight of their regrets. I lay down beside him, and for the first time, he moved closer. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body like a small sun in the darkness. Our breathing found its rhythm, that familiar synchronization that had become as natural as heartbeat, but underneath it I could sense something else. A tension that hadn't been there before, a awareness of possibility that made the space between us feel charged with potential. I slept that night, but my dreams were different, vivid and strange, filled with images that felt more real than memory. I dreamed of David, of the kiss we had shared in that laboratory 20 years ago, but in the dream, I didn't pull away. I dreamed of Michael's photographs, of light falling across surfaces in ways that transformed the ordinary into the sublime. I dreamed of wood grain and quantum particles, of things that seemed separate but were somehow connected by forces I couldn't name. When I woke, it was still dark, but I could sense that dawn was approaching. Emery was awake beside me, and when I turned toward him, I could see his eyes reflecting the faint light from the monitors. We looked at each other across the narrow space that separated us, and I felt something pass between us that was deeper than words. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. We lay there in the gathering dawn, two men who had found something in each other that they hadn't known they were looking for, something that was too fragile to examine too closely, but too powerful to ignore. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the world remained transformed, covered in a blanket of white that made everything look new. Inside, in the red-tinted darkness of our temporary sanctuary, something was awakening that would change everything we thought we knew about ourselves. The crack in the architecture of my life had widened, and through it, light was pouring in like water through a broken dam. I was no longer the same man who had kissed his wife goodbye 5 days ago, who had driven to Vermont thinking he was seeking a cure for insomnia. I was becoming someone else, someone I had glimpsed in fragments over the years, but never allowed myself to fully inhabit. And lying there beside Emery, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing and the warmth of his presence, I realized that I was no longer afraid of that transformation. I was finally ready to let it happen. The sixth night brought with it a kind of electricity that I felt in my skin before I even understood what was happening. All day, I had been aware of Emery in ways that went beyond the careful observation I had grown accustomed to. When he laughed at something in his book, I felt it in my chest. When he stretched in his chair, extending his arms above his head in a gesture that lifted his shirt slightly, I found myself looking away too quickly, as if I had been caught doing something inappropriate. The technicians seemed more attentive that evening, making their rounds with a thoroughness that felt almost intrusive. They checked our wires twice, adjusted our monitors with unnecessary precision, asked questions about our comfort levels that seemed designed to keep us awake rather than help us sleep. I wondered if they had noticed something in our data, some anomaly that had caught their attention. Dr. Martinez appeared just before lights out, making what she called a routine check, but which felt more like an inspection. She studied our charts with the intensity of someone reading a foreign language, making notes that seemed to go on longer than usual. "Everything looks good," she said finally, but there was something in her tone that suggested she was withholding judgment. "Tomorrow is your final night. I hope you'll both be able to take what you've learned here and apply it to your sleep routines at home." The words hit me like cold water. Tomorrow was our final night. In 36 hours, I would be driving back to Hartford, back to my colonial house and my quiet marriage and my carefully constructed life. Back to the grandfather clock marking time in the hallway. Back to the empty spaces where Naomi's presence used to fill the silence. Back to lying beside Elise in our king-sized bed and pretending that everything was fine. After Dr. Martinez left, the clinic settled into its evening quiet, but something felt different. The air itself seemed thicker, charged with an urgency that made every sound more significant. I could hear Emery moving in his bed, the soft rustle of sheets that suggested he was as restless as I was. When the technicians completed their final rounds and left us alone, I waited for the familiar signal that would tell me it was safe to cross the distance between our beds. But instead of the settling quiet I had grown to expect, I heard something else. A sharp, persistent beeping that made my heart race before I understood what it was. "Fire alarm," Emery said, his voice cutting through the electronic shriek. "Probably just a drill." The lights came on, harsh and fluorescent after the gentle red glow we had grown accustomed to. The clinic transformed instantly from our intimate sanctuary into a clinical space filled with urgent voices and the sounds of people moving with practiced efficiency. The technicians appeared in our doorway, professional and calm despite the chaos. They began disconnecting our monitoring equipment with swift, practiced movements, their hands working to free us from the web of wires that had tethered us to the machines. "Everyone needs to evacuate," one of them said. "Just a precaution. We'll have you back inside in 15 minutes. We were herded toward the exit along with the other patients, a small group of people who looked as disoriented as I felt. Someone handed us thin blankets, the kind they use in emergency rooms, and we found ourselves standing in the parking lot in the Vermont cold, watching our breath curl in the air like smoke. The snow had stopped, but the world was still transformed, covered in a pristine white that made everything look like a photograph. The temperature was bitter, the kind of cold that makes your lungs ache and your eyes water. I pulled my blanket tighter around my shoulders and looked for Emery in the small crowd of displaced patients. He was standing a few feet away, wrapped in his own blanket, looking up at the building we had just evacuated. In the harsh light of the emergency floods, I could see him clearly for the first time in days. Really see him, not just the shadowy figure I had grown accustomed to in the red-tinted darkness of our room. He was younger than I had imagined, maybe 35, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that comes from working outdoors. His hair was darker than it had appeared in the clinic lighting, and there was something about the way he held himself that suggested a comfort with his own body that I had never possessed. When he noticed me looking, he moved closer, and we stood together in the cold, two men wrapped in hospital blankets, watching the building that had become our temporary home. "False alarm," one of the technicians announced. "Faulty sensor in the kitchen. We'll have everyone back inside in a few minutes." But I wasn't ready to go back inside. Something about standing there in the open air, away from the controlled environment of the clinic, made me feel more awake than I had in days. The cold was sharp and clean, cutting through the artificial atmosphere I had been breathing for nearly a week. Emery must have felt it too, because he didn't move toward the building when the technicians began shepherding people back inside. Instead, he turned to me, and in the harsh light of the emergency floods, I could see something in his eyes that made my chest tighten. "When this ends," he said, his voice quiet enough that only I could hear, "are we just going to forget it?" The question hung between us and the cold air, more visible than our breath. It was the thing we had both been avoiding, the reality that waited beyond the artificial sanctuary of the sleep clinic. In 2 days, we would return to our separate lives, to the routines and relationships that had brought us here in the first place. I wanted to tell him no, that what we had found together was too important to abandon. But I also knew how complicated the truth was. I had a wife who was waiting for me to come home fixed, a marriage that was built on foundations I was no longer sure I understood. He had his own life, his own complications, his own history of loss that I was only beginning to comprehend. "I don't know," I said finally, and the honesty of it felt like stepping off a cliff. We stood there in the cold, looking at each other across a distance that felt both vast and intimate, and I realized that this was the first time we had really seen each other. Not just the shadowy figures we had become in the darkness of the clinic, but the actual people we were outside of that carefully controlled environment. The technicians were calling for everyone to return to the building, their voices carrying across the parking lot with increasing urgency. Around us, the other patients began moving back toward the entrance, eager to escape the cold and return to their warm beds. But neither of us moved. We stood there in the snow, wrapped in our thin blankets, looking at each other with something that felt like recognition, as if we were finally seeing not just who we were, but who we might become together. "Come on," Emery said finally, tilting his head toward the building. "Let's go back." But as we walked back toward the clinic, I felt something shift between us. The question he had asked hung in the air like a challenge, and I realized that we had crossed some invisible line. We were no longer just two men sharing a bed for comfort. We were two men who had acknowledged that what was happening between us mattered, that it was real enough to survive beyond the artificial boundaries of this place. Back in our room, the technicians worked to reconnect our monitoring equipment, their hands moving with practiced efficiency to restore the web of wires that tethered us to the machines. But something had changed in the brief time we had spent outside. The room felt different, smaller somehow, as if our excursion into the real world had altered the proportions of our sanctuary. We settled back into our beds, and I waited for the familiar signal that would tell me it was safe to cross the distance between us. But when the technicians left and the lights dimmed to their usual red glow, I found myself hesitating. The question Emery had asked in the parking lot had changed something fundamental between us, had introduced a weight that made our careful boundaries feel suddenly fragile. I lay in my bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the clinic settling into its nighttime rhythm, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not desire, exactly, but something deeper. A recognition of possibility that made my chest feel tight and my breathing shallow. "Julian," Emery said softly, and there was something in the way he said my name that made me turn toward him. I could see him in the dim light, propped up on one elbow, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. The blankets had fallen away from his shoulders, and I could see the line of his collarbone, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. "Come here," he said, and it wasn't a request. I crossed the distance between our beds, but this time it felt different, more deliberate, more dangerous. When I lay down beside him, he didn't move away to give me space. Instead, he turned toward me, and for the first time since we had begun sharing this narrow bed, we were close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my face. We lay there in the darkness, looking at each other across the small space that separated us, and I felt something building between us that was both inevitable and impossible. The careful boundaries we had established, the unspoken rules that had allowed us to share this intimacy, without crossing lines that neither of us was ready to cross, began to feel like walls that were meant to be broken down. I reached out, almost without thinking, and touched his face. Gently, slowly. My fingers traced the line of his jaw, the curve of his cheek, the softness of his lower lip. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into my touch, his eyes closing as if he were trying to memorize the sensation. And then, without planning it, without considering the consequences, I kissed him. It was soft, almost apologetic, the kind of kiss that asks permission even as it breaks every rule. But it landed like thunder, shaking something loose in my chest that I had been holding tight for decades. I felt his lips move against mine, felt him kiss me back with a gentleness that made my entire body tremble. The kiss lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it contained entire lifetimes. 20 years of wondering what might have happened if I hadn't pulled away from David. 18 years of lying beside Elise and feeling like I was performing a role I had never auditioned for. 41 years of living in a body that I had never fully inhabited, of wanting things I had never allowed myself to name. When we broke apart, I could see something in his eyes that reflected what I was feeling. Not just desire, but recognition. The acknowledgement of a truth that we had both been circling around for days, something that was too powerful to ignore, but too dangerous to examine too closely. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. For kissing him, or for taking so long to do it. "Don't be," he said, his voice barely audible in the darkness. "Don't be sorry for this." We lay there in the aftermath, not touching but connected by something that felt stronger than physical contact. The kiss had changed everything, had transformed the careful friendship we had built into something more complex and infinitely more frightening. I could feel my heart beating against my ribs, could hear the sound of my own breathing in the silence. Outside, Vermont slept under its blanket of snow. Inside, in the red-tinted darkness of our temporary sanctuary, two men lay awake, trying to understand what they had just discovered about themselves and each other. The kiss had been soft, almost innocent, but it had opened a door that I wasn't sure I was ready to walk through. That night, I dreamed of the younger version of myself that I had seen in fragments over the years, the man I might have been if I had been braver, if I had been willing to risk everything for the chance to live authentically. In the dream, I was standing at a train station, but this time I wasn't watching someone disappear into the fog. This time, I was the one boarding the train, heading toward a destination I couldn't name but knew I needed to reach. When I woke, it was to the sound of the technicians preparing for their morning rounds. Emery was still asleep beside me, his face peaceful in the growing light. I watched him for a moment, memorizing the curve of his eyelashes, the way his lips were slightly parted, the steady rise and fall of his chest. In 12 hours, this would be over. We would say goodbye, exchange phone numbers with promises to stay in touch, and return to our separate lives. But the kiss had changed something fundamental between us, had introduced a possibility that I wasn't sure I was ready to abandon. I touched my lips, remembering the softness of his mouth, the way he had kissed me back with such gentleness. It had been the most honest moment of my adult life, the first time I had allowed myself to want something without calculating the cost. And lying there in the growing dawn, watching Emery sleep, I realized that I was no longer the same person who had driven to Vermont a week ago. The careful architecture of my life had been shaken by something as simple as a kiss, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to rebuild it or let it fall. The final morning at the clinic arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that only comes after snow, when the world looks freshly made and impossibly clean. I woke before the technicians came for their final rounds, and for the first time in a week, I felt truly rested. Not just the absence of exhaustion, but something deeper. A kind of peace that came from finally understanding something about myself that I had been avoiding for decades. Emery was already awake, lying on his back and staring at the ceiling with an expression I couldn't read. We had slept pressed closer together after the kiss, not touching but aware of each other's presence in a way that felt both natural and revolutionary. The narrow bed that had seemed impossible to share now felt like the only place in the world where either of us truly belonged. The morning routine felt different this time. The technicians were more thorough, documenting everything with the precision of archaeologists cataloging artifacts. They asked more questions about our sleep quality, our dream patterns, our overall experience with the study. I answered with the kind of careful neutrality I had perfected over years of faculty meetings, giving them the data they needed without revealing anything that mattered. Dr. Martinez appeared for our final evaluation, armed with charts and graphs that told the story of our week in patterns and percentages. She seemed particularly interested in my results, pointing to measurements that apparently indicated a dramatic improvement in my sleep architecture. "This is remarkable," she said, tracing lines on a graph that meant nothing to me. "Your REM cycles have completely normalized. Your sleep efficiency has improved by 60%. Whatever you've learned here, I hope you'll be able to maintain it at home." The word home hit me like a physical blow. In 4 hours, I would be driving back to Hartford, back to the life I had built so carefully and was now not sure I wanted to inhabit. The thought of returning to my empty house, to the gentle distance of my marriage, to the routine that had once felt like security and now felt like a prison, made my chest tighten with something that might have been panic. Emery and I exchanged phone numbers in the parking lot, standing beside our cars like strangers who had shared a cab ride and were now going their separate ways. The gesture felt both necessary and inadequate, a small bridge across the vast distance that was about to open between us. "Call me," he said, and there was something in his voice that made the words feel like a lifeline. "I will," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The drive back to Hartford took exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes, the same route I had taken a week ago, but in reverse. I played the same classical music station, stopped at the same rest area for coffee, followed the same highway signs that marked the distance between my temporary sanctuary and my permanent life. But everything looked different now, as if the landscape itself had been altered by what I had experienced. I thought about the kiss, about the way Emery had looked at me in the darkness before and after, about the feeling of finally allowing myself to want something without calculating the cost. The memory of it sat in my chest like a small sun, warming me from the inside out, but also making me acutely aware of how cold everything else felt by comparison. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly as I had left it, but smaller somehow. The colonial architecture that had once seemed solid and reassuring now felt like a costume I was being asked to wear, a role I was expected to play without question. I sat in the car for a long moment, looking at the windows that reflected nothing but sky, trying to remember what it felt like to call this place home. Elise met me at the door with the kind of warm concern that had characterized our entire marriage. She asked about the study, about whether I felt rested, about what the doctors had told me. I answered her questions with the same careful neutrality I had used with the technicians, giving her information without revealing anything that mattered. She had prepared my favorite dinner, as if my return were a celebration rather than a retreat. We sat at our kitchen table, the same table where we had shared thousands of meals, and I told her about the clinic's routine, about the monitoring equipment, about the other patients I had met. I did not tell her about Emery. I did not tell her about the narrow bed we had shared, about the confessions we had whispered in the darkness, about the kiss that had changed everything I thought I knew about myself. That night, I lay in our king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to Elise's breathing beside me. The space felt vast and empty, nothing like the intimate sanctuary I had grown accustomed to. I found myself reaching across the mattress, my hands searching for warmth that wasn't there, for a presence that had become essential to my ability to rest. Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and fitful. I woke repeatedly, my body expecting to find someone beside me, my breathing trying to synchronize with a rhythm that existed only in memory. By morning, I felt more exhausted than I had in months, as if returning to my old life had somehow undone all the healing I had experienced. The next few days passed in a blur of failed attempts to return to normal. I went through the motions of my routine, teaching my classes, grading papers, having dinner with Elise, and making appropriate conversation about our respective days. But it felt like I was performing a role in a play I no longer understood, delivering lines that had lost their meaning. Elise noticed, of course. She was too observant not to see the way I would startle when she spoke to me, the way I would stand at the kitchen window staring at nothing, the way I would reach for my phone and then set it down without making the call I was thinking about making. 3 days after my return, she found me in my study, holding the folded brochure from the sleep clinic. I had been staring at it for 20 minutes, remembering the weight of institutional blankets and the sound of monitors beeping in the darkness. She stood in the doorway, watching me with the kind of patient attention she usually reserved for library patrons who needed help finding something they couldn't quite name. "How was it really?" she asked, and there was something in her tone that suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be what either of us wanted to hear. I could have lied. I could have told her that it was exactly what she had hoped it would be, that the doctors had given me strategies for better sleep, that I was fixed and ready to return to being the husband she deserved. But sitting there in my study, surrounded by the books and papers that represented the life I had built so carefully, I found I couldn't do it anymore. "I met someone," I said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff. She didn't ask for details. She didn't demand explanations or declarations. She simply stood there in the doorway, looking at me with an expression that was somehow both surprised and not surprised at all, as if she had been waiting for this moment for years. "Nothing happened," I said quickly, which was technically true and completely false at the same time. "But something did happen. Something important." She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her processing the information, trying to understand what I was telling her and what I wasn't. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "I always wondered when you'd tell the truth," she said. The words hit me like cold water. Not accusation, but recognition. The acknowledgement of something we had both been avoiding, something that had been growing in the spaces between us for years. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. She moved into the room, settling into the chair across from my desk with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. She looked at me with eyes that held 18 years of marriage, 18 years of watching me perform the role of husband without ever fully inhabiting it. "I mean that I've been married to you for 18 years, and I've never felt like I really knew you. Not the real you. There's always been something you were holding back, something you were afraid to show me. I thought maybe it was just your personality, the way some people are naturally reserved. But it wasn't that, was it?" I wanted to deny it, to tell her that she was wrong, that I had given her everything I had to give. But sitting there in my study, remembering the way I had felt lying beside Emery in that narrow bed, I realized that she was right. I had been holding back, not just from her, but from myself, for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to be fully present in my own life. "No," I said finally. "It wasn't that." She nodded, as if my admission confirmed something she had known all along. There was sadness in her expression, but also something that might have been relief. As if she had been waiting for this conversation as long as I had been avoiding it. "What happened at the clinic?" she asked. I told her about Emery, about the way we had found comfort in each other's presence, about the conversations we had shared in the darkness. I told her about the kiss, about the way it had felt like the most honest moment of my adult life. I told her about the dream I had been having, about the younger version of myself standing at a train station, finally ready to board the train instead of watching it disappear. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. I could see her thinking, trying to understand what this meant for us, for the life we had built together. "Are you in love with him?" she asked finally. "I don't know," I said, which was the most honest answer I could give. "I don't know what I'm feeling. I just know that I can't pretend anymore that everything is fine." She stood up then, moving to the window that overlooked our backyard. The snow had mostly melted, revealing the brown grass and bare trees that marked the end of another Vermont winter. She stood there for a long time, and I could see her reflection in the glass, overlaid on the landscape beyond. "I've known this was coming," she said finally. "Maybe not this exactly, but something. You've been disappearing for years, Julian. Little by little, day by day. I kept thinking maybe it was just a phase, maybe you'd find your way back to us. But you weren't disappearing from us. You were disappearing from yourself." The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. She was right. I had been disappearing, not just from my marriage but from my own life, living on the surface of an existence that had stopped fitting me years ago. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it in ways that went deeper than words could carry. She turned from the window, and I could see tears in her eyes, but they weren't the tears of someone who had been betrayed. They were the tears of someone who had been watching someone she loved suffer and hadn't known how to help. "So am I," she said. "For both of us." That night, I packed a single duffel bag with clothes and toiletries, the same bag I had taken to the sleep clinic. Elise helped me, moving through our bedroom with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else, folding shirts and gathering socks, as if she were helping me prepare for a business trip rather than the end of our marriage. We didn't talk about lawyers or division of assets or custody arrangements for Naomi. Those conversations would come later, when we were both ready to face the practical realities of unmaking a life we had spent 18 years building. For now, it was enough to acknowledge that something had broken that couldn't be fixed, that we both deserved the chance to find happiness in ways that didn't require the other to be someone they weren't. I left that night, driving away from the house that had been my home for 12 years, away from the life I had built so carefully and was now abandoning. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay. The highway stretched ahead of me, dark and empty, leading toward a future I couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was driving towards something rather than away from it. The careful architecture of my life had finally collapsed, and in its ruins, I was beginning to glimpse the possibility of building something new. Something that might actually fit the person I was becoming, rather than the person I had thought I was supposed to be. 5 months later, I found myself driving through coastal Maine on a Tuesday morning in late spring, following directions I had memorized but never thought I would use. The number Emery had given me in the clinic parking lot had lived in my phone like a secret, a possibility I carried with me through the long weeks of lawyers and moving boxes and the careful dismantling of a life I had spent 18 years building. I had called him once, 3 weeks after I left the house in Hartford. It was 2 in the morning, and I was sitting in a motel room in Albany, halfway between my old life and nowhere in particular. The divorce papers were spread across the small table, and I was staring at them with the same incomprehension I felt when students showed me equations they couldn't solve. His voice had been warm and sleepy when he answered, but he had sounded genuinely glad to hear from me. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, about the weather and the strange taste of motel coffee and the way highway rest stops all looked the same in fluorescent light. I didn't tell him about the papers on the table or the way I had been driving in circles for weeks, afraid to go anywhere that might feel like a destination. When I hung up, I felt both better and worse. Better because his voice had reminded me that what we had shared was real, that the kiss and the confessions and the narrow bed weren't just figments of my imagination. Worse because I realized I was still not ready to reach for what I wanted, still too afraid of what it might cost. That was the last time we spoke until the morning I woke up in a small apartment in Burlington and realized that I had been hiding from my own life for long enough. I had been teaching as an adjunct at the University of Vermont, living in a furnished studio that felt like an extended hotel stay, going through the motions of building a new life without ever committing to actually living it. The apartment was fine, the teaching was adequate, and I was sleeping better than I had in years. But I felt like I was still performing a role, still pretending to be someone I wasn't sure I wanted to be. I had left my marriage, but I hadn't moved toward anything. I had simply traded one kind of suspension for another. That morning, I called the information operator and asked for the number of woodworking shops in coastal Maine. There were dozens, but when I described what I remembered about Emery's work, about the garden trellises and antique window frames, the operator connected me to a place called Callahan Millwork in a town called Pemaquid Point. The woman who answered the phone told me that Emery wasn't in, that he was working on a project at the greenhouse workshop about 10 miles up the coast. She gave me directions in the casual way that people in small towns give directions, assuming I would know where the old Mackenzie place was, where the road curved past the lighthouse. I drove there without calling ahead, without making a plan, without considering what I would say when I saw him. I just drove, following the coastal road as it wound between pine trees and glimpses of ocean, feeling something like peace settle over me for the first time in months. The greenhouse workshop was exactly what I had imagined when Emery described his work. A converted barn with walls of glass that caught the morning light and threw it back in patterns that made the air itself seem golden. I could see him before I got out of the car, standing at a workbench with his back to me, wearing the same kind of flannel shirt he had worn at the clinic. I sat in the car for a moment, watching him work, remembering the way he had talked about listening to what the wood wanted to become. He was sanding a beam of cedar, his movements rhythmic and precise, and I could see the concentration in the line of his shoulders, the way he held his whole body in service to the task. When I finally got out of the car, he must have heard my footsteps on the gravel, because he turned around. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the distance of the workshop, two men who had shared something profound and were now trying to figure out what it meant in the clear light of day. He didn't look surprised to see me. He didn't rush toward me or demand explanations or ask what had taken me so long. He simply set down his sandpaper and smiled, the same easy smile that had made me notice him in the first place. "I haven't slept," I said, which wasn't exactly true, but felt like the most honest thing I could say. He walked to a small kitchenette in the corner of the workshop and poured hot water from a thermos into 2 ceramic mugs. The tea was something herbal and unfamiliar, but it tasted like peace. He handed me one of the mugs and pointed to a simple cot in the corner, covered with a quilt that looked handmade. I lay down without asking questions, without explaining why I was there or what I hoped would happen. The cot was narrow, not much wider than the bed we had shared at the clinic, and it smelled like sawdust and something else I couldn't identify, something that might have been contentment. Emery returned to his work, and I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of sandpaper against wood, to the soft whisper of dust settling, to the distant sound of waves against rocks. For the first time in months, I felt my mind quiet, felt the endless loop of worry and analysis that had been my constant companion simply stop. I didn't sleep immediately. I lay there on the cot, feeling the warmth of the spring sun through the glass walls, listening to Emery work, and realized that this was what I had been driving toward all along. Not just him, though he was part of it, but this feeling of being in the right place, of being in harmony with myself and my surroundings in a way I had never experienced before. When I finally did sleep, it was the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who had finally stopped running from themselves. I woke hours later to the sound of rain on glass and the smell of something cooking. Emery was at the small stove, stirring something in a pot that smelled like home. He looked over when he heard me stirring, and there was something in his expression that made my chest tighten with recognition. Not desire, exactly, but something deeper. The acknowledgement of a connection that had survived separation, that had been waiting patiently for us to find our way back to each other. We didn't talk about what would happen next. We didn't make declarations or promises or plans. We simply existed in that moment, in that space filled with golden light and the smell of cedar and the sound of rain on glass, and let the possibility of something new settle around us like the sawdust that hung in the air. Outside, the Maine coast stretched away in both directions, wild and beautiful and patient. Inside, in the warmth of the greenhouse workshop, 2 men sat across from each other at a small table, sharing a simple meal and the kind of comfortable silence that comes only after you have stopped being afraid of who you really are. I still don't know what will happen next. I don't know if this is the beginning of something or just another temporary arrangement. But lying on that cot, listening to Emery's breathing in the darkness, Feeling the rhythm of his presence beside me, I realized that I have finally stopped asking those questions. For now, it's enough to be here, in this place that smells like possibility and feels like home. It's enough to have found my way back to the man who once asked me to switch beds for just one night, who offered me something I didn't know I needed, who is now offering me something even more precious, the chance to build a life that fits the person I have finally learned to be.